Greetings to all of you. My name is Hannah Andre, and I serve North Park Theological Seminary as Associate Professor of Church History, and this year as Interim Dean of Faculty. And so in that latter role, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event on behalf of North Park Seminary faculty and staff. This is our second public theology session of the academic year, and we're really grateful to each of you for joining us and being part of these sessions. I want to, before we get started, express some thanks. First to Luke Palmerly for all of his administrative coordination of this event behind the scenes and even now, connecting us through Zoom. And also to the Lilly Endowment for their financial sponsorship. I think you'll already have seen that we are live streaming this event. We're also recording it for future watching. And we'll do that in the speaker view, but if you have any concern about being recorded, then feel free to turn off your camera now. So once again, welcome. We are in our third year of holding these public conversations, which were originally prompted by some of the new restrictions and also new questions posed by the COVID pandemic. The theme that we have chosen for this year, centered in the storm, is focused on resting in Christ. And importantly, resting in Christ not as an escape from the needs of the world, but instead as a necessary means to the transformative work of the church in the world. And in this, we're inspired by Jesus' invitation in Matthew 11:28-30. So today's session, the second in our series of 3 over the course of this academic year, is called Finding Rest in God, Therapeutic and Ministry Insights, and is organized and coordinated by our ministry field. Leading us in this particular discussion, we're grateful and honored to be joined by 2 outstanding guides, Deborah Masten and Hilary Wildt. So our Dr. Elizabeth Pierre, our Associate Professor of Pastoral Care and Counseling, and our Ministry Field Chair will be introducing our speakers at greater length. But before turning it over to Dr. Pierre to get us started, I want to invite all of us to join a practice that the North Park Seminary faculty and staff has been practicing this year as we begin our meetings, our faculty and staff in field meetings. And that's to enter into a minute of silence to center ourselves as we enter this conversation. So I'm going to read to you from our text for the year, Matthew 11:28-30 in the Message version. And then I'll follow that with a minute of silence, which then I'll break. So join me, close your eyes if you would like, but join me in a time of centering silence. Are you tired, worn out, burned out? Come to me. Get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly.
Thank you so much, Dean Hannah, for this time of centering. It's so appropriate given our conversation today. And it is my pleasure to introduce two fabulous friends and colleagues. We have Deborah Masten, who is a counselor and is currently the Director of Global Personnel with Serve Globally, a part of the ECC Church. She's formerly on the staff of Quest Church in Seattle as the Associate Director of Global and Local Ministries. Deborah's also a licensed therapist, and she lived in Cambodia for 14 years, has 3 adult children who live on the West Coast, and is captivated, I agree, Alvin Ailey, by the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater. And she's a huge Lenny Kravitz fan. Agreed. I love that too. So Deb is just she's brilliant, she's kind, and she's funny. You're in for a treat. And then we have Dr. Hilary Wildt. She is a PsyD and LCP and is the founder and executive director of Tamani Counseling Services, where I also work. So she's a friend and colleague. She's devoted to increasing access to mental health services through culturally and contextually informed therapy, research, training, and teaching. She has the privilege of working with children, adolescents, and adults from many countries, nationalities, and cultural and religious backgrounds. Her specialties include post-traumatic stress, relationship difficulties, grief and mourning, marriage and couples counseling, and coping with change and transitions. She enjoys working cross-culturally and with international populations. And it's also her birthday today, so you got to give a shout out for her. She's presenting on her birthday. And a couple of weeks ago, we connected, just Deb and Hilary and I, and that was the first time they met each other, and great chemistry. They're just cool people and have so much to offer us today. So welcome them both. Hilary's going to start us off, and then and Deb will follow afterwards. And then, one last thing, Reverend Michelle Dotson, our associate pastor and New Covenant Community Church, is going to be our moderator for the questions time. She's a doctoral candidate of Loyola University. Whoop, whoop. Doctors coming soon, in a sociology of religion with an emphasis on multiracial congregations. She's been dedicated to the work of reconciliation for over 2 decades, helping plant 2 intentionally multiracial churches in Chicago, New Community Covenant Church Logan Square, and New Community Covenant Church in Bronzeville. She received her MDiv from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary and MA at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She's the co-editor of Challenging the Status Quo, Diversity, Democracy, and Equality in the 21st Century. Last but far from least, she and her husband, Carlos, are the proud parents of 2 amazing daughters. They remind her every day why this work is important. So shout out to our Professor Dodson, who will be moderating after our 2 amazing speakers present. All right, Hilary, you're on. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. And thank you everybody for the birthday wishes. It's a pleasure to be here on my birthday. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. And give me the thumbs up if you can see. Great. Love whenever technology works. It's not always the case. So I am Dr. Hilary Wildt. You can call me Hilary. And I am, as we were kind of discussing what we wanted to talk about today with you, one of the things that really came up is wanting to talk about this from a systems perspective as well as a personal perspective. And one thing that we were really discussing was that if our systems don't allow for rest, that it's really hard to find spaces where we can rest. And so having that in mind is important. And so we started with, of course, this verse. And as I was looking into this verse, I was really just struck that, Jesus here, he uses the imagery of the yoke. And this is something that people would often use whenever talking about being connected with a rabbi or a teacher. And so he is in this verse calling us to personally rest in him. But he's also calling out the systems that aren't allowing for his people to rest as well. And so just a few chapters later in Matthew, we see him do this pretty explicitly. And so we see that Jesus's yoke, and I like the King James Version and New King James. So Um, his yoke is meek and lowly of heart, and you find rest unto your soul. His burden is light. But as he's talking about the yoke that the teachers of the law and the Pharisees were putting on their people, so the systems, the religious systems that were in place, he talks about they tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for people to see. They love the place of honor and the most important seats. They love to be greeted with respect. And so very different yokes here, and very contrasting yokes. So as I was kind of thinking about that verse and thinking about, Jesus and what he calls us into and invites us into, it's not just rest, right? It's restoration. He invites us to be restored. And that only comes through our relationship with Jesus. We can't get that through, we can have the best self-care plan in the world. And I'm all about self-care. I love self-care, but it's not it, right? It's not the end. We can't have rest without Jesus, the Lord of the Sabbath. He comes and he fulfills perfect Sabbath rest for us. And so if you come away with one thing today, that's what you can come away with, is that we find rest in Jesus, period, full stop. And so if we can create systems that allow for this and point to Jesus, not to ourselves, then we're going to be pointing people to rest. And the other thing to really be thinking about throughout this is that every human relationship is broken. We see this everywhere. We particularly see this in psychology, and that's what we study a lot of. And we also know that we often project our own brokenness onto God. And so we see our brokenness in God, even when it's not there, right? We know that God's not broken, but we project our brokenness onto him. And then we bring it into our relationship with him. And we do this through our ministries. We do this in our work. We do this in our personal relationships. And so as you're kind of thinking about seeking rest and kind of laying down the burden that Jesus speaks against, the burden of striving for our salvation, really, ask yourselves, one, what are you striving for in your ministry, in your life, in your work? And you can do this on your own. It's a great practice to kind of be thinking about, especially if you're feeling a little bit burnt out. What's burning you out? So what are you striving for? What are you trying to prove? We're all, if we really think about it, trying to prove something to somebody at certain points in our lives. And so there's no shame in admitting it. It's just something to recognize and to be able to work through. And all of this brokenness, it's not the brokenness that's necessarily the problem. It's whenever we don't acknowledge our brokenness and bring it to God that it becomes a problem. And so allow yourself to see your brokenness and bring it to God. And then be thinking, what makes me reactive and who makes me reactive? And so we know that psychology often talks about a fun term, differentiation. And differentiation just means that we're not reactive. We kind of stand on our values and are able to act consistently across relationship and in kind of in a consistent way with our values. And the opposite of that is reactivity. And so reacting to anxiety, reacting to what people are doing around us, reacting to broken systems. And so if things make you reactive, think about those and how can we bring those to God and be more proactive than reactive. And then what am I running away from? How do I view God? And when do I know when I'm walking with Jesus? So if you do this activity, as you're looking at your systems, as you're looking at your ministry, that this can really kind of start to free you from the other yoke so that you can take up Jesus's yoke and walk with him. So here's a few tenets that I just kind of put together for restorative systems. So these are things that build into your systems, build into your ministries, build into your life. First, invite others into relationship with Christ. It seems really simple, and some of what God tells us to do is very simple. It's hard, but it's simple. And so the focus can't be on the leadership. It can't be on the mission even. We will be mission driven. We will have a vision that we're working towards, but that can't be the focus. That can't be the end goal. Really, if we're doing ministry, it needs to be Christ. And then remembering always that ministry is an invitation, not an obligation. The minute we start to feel like we're obligated to do this in any kind of way, we start to resent. This is where those broken relationships come in. We start to resent God. We start to resent the people that we're called to. We start to resent the people who aren't doing the work that we're doing. But it's an invitation. It's a way that we get to join in with God and the work that he's doing. And so, walk in that invitation. However, that doesn't. Sometimes we then think, oh, we don't have any expectations, or Jesus doesn't have any expectations. That's also not the case. Invitation doesn't negate expectation. So we're invited into it, and there's expectations that come with that. And they're not the heavy load of rules and things that we need to follow, letter of the law type things, but there are expectations, and God makes those clear, and they're usually for our good and the good of others in the Bible. And then reduce the need for striving. And so this is the burden that the Pharisees were putting on the people, is the burden of striving, of having to do enough and be enough, and kind of a works-based mentality. And so let's reduce the need for striving. This is hard to do, easy to say, hard to do, because we live in a system that prides itself in being productive, and getting things done. And all of those things are good, but they're not God. And so, productivity, I think we can't be looking at productivity as being the same as fruit. Yes, we write grants. We kind of have to measure our effectiveness based on productivity whenever we do that. But internally, it's not the same as fruit, and we need to keep that straight. Our ministry is not our identity either. And this is one thing I find a lot with therapists and psychologists, is if that becomes their only identity, it becomes really difficult for them to do good work. And so we need to love our ministry. And yes, it's an important part of who we are, but it's not all of who we are. And it certainly does not define our worthiness. And it does not define the way that God sees us. Again, our ministry is a way that we can walk with Jesus, not a way that we can prove to Jesus that we're good enough. And then build in some rituals and rhythms for rest, not just retreat. And so I like retreats. I think they're great. I think they're fun. I love vacations, but they're not enough. You need to also have these natural rituals and rhythms of rest. And we see these throughout the Bible. We see these actually as laws, and how people work with the land, and how people Sabbath rest, those types of things. And so find ways to build in rituals and rhythms of rest. Very practically, these can be as simple as having a ritual that tells you that you're done with your work day and that you're moving into something new. I clean my desk every day to kind of just, it's done, it's packed up, and I'm moving on to something new here. And so it doesn't have to be lighting a candle, although that's great. It doesn't have to be something like that. It can be something very practical. And then guard against pride and competitiveness in your systems. It's really easy to foster a culture of competitiveness. Friendly competitiveness is fun. I love games, I love sports, right? But let's not do it in a way that, again, is kind of proving our worthiness or proving our worth in any way. And so ways that you can do this, make sure that you're really seeing everybody's skills and gifts. So you don't want a whole team of people around you that are exactly the same and offer the same thing to your system. That doesn't really work. It's just an arm going like this, right? It doesn't have the rest of the body to work with. And so as you're kind of choosing people on teams and in ministry, diversify, welcome people with different perspectives, and actually welcome those and listen to those and to see those gifts that people have that might not be the natural gifts that lead to productivity, but they lead to fruit. And so using those. And then train and equip. There are things that people need to know how to do in ministry. And so instead of kind of just putting them in positions where that isn't necessary, you can also train and equip and find those people with the skills to train and equip, because those people are out there, and those people are very, very important to good functioning systems. They love training and equipping and lifting up. And then have financial stewardship within organizations and within ministry, not financial idolatry, and also within just regular everyday life. And so having wisdom without over-focusing. And this can go both ways. I've seen it go in the direction of wanting to over-focus on money so that you have more money. And then I've also seen it in the opposite of over-focusing on not wanting to appear to have a certain amount of money, right? And so both can become idols in your life. Puts money at the center and not Jesus. If those choices are made because of Jesus, that's a different story. And then, Elizabeth, how am I doing on time here? Okay, great. Thanks. And then also, as we're kind of thinking, so I'm doing high level here, and if you have questions, please flood the chat with questions. This is to start a discussion, not to end one. And so for restorative systems, we do need to focus on restorative leadership as well. And so having in mind, and there's lots of good research and literature written about servant leaders. So being humble and leading from behind, and remembering that Jesus's yoke is gentle, lowly, compassionate, humble, right? And so if we're not fostering those, we might be taking up a different yoke that we might want to look at. And then we are suffering servants, but we don't suffer just for suffering's sake. And so I see this a lot too, where we idolize suffering. We have to suffer to prove that we are Christian. And that gets ugly fast, right? Because then your God is suffering. You're not suffering for anything. You're just suffering to suffer. And so make sure that we're suffering for the gospel, not just for suffering's sake. And we do need to take breaks. Jesus took breaks, and we're not better than him. So we need breaks too. So don't be afraid to take those breaks. It's necessary. And then just always kind of keeping in mind, I think as leaders, that the vision we've been given for whatever ministry you're in is not it is for us. God gave us a vision, but it's not just for us, right? He gives us visions for the wider community. And so how does that, play out in your life, and how can you kind of make sure that you're looking at how your vision affects everyone else and moves with everyone else's visions as well. And then keeping in mind, this is just a balance thing, that our lives are a ministry. Everything we do in our life is a ministry, but our ministry is not our life. And when it becomes our life, we want to try to ask those questions from the beginning. What are we striving for? Have we moved our ministry into the place of Christ? Have we grabbed onto that yoke that the Pharisees were trying to sell? That's what I have for you today.
That's wonderful, Hillary. Thank you so
Thank you.
much. Yes, I'm sure this is going to engender a lot of questions. We're moving it on to now Deb. Thank you so much, Deb.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Hillary, that we got to see the 30 or the overall view from systems. So I think it's very important to have that and to have that sense of what's the context for this rest and what's the hopeful context for this rest. And so my portion of this will get highly anecdotal and it'll be personal because I am a Black woman in certain spaces. And so it'll be reflective of that. And I hope also there'll be a sense in which you too can latch on to find those places where this makes sense for your world, which is also very intense. And it's also very challenging around trying to find those places for finding rest. So I just kind of say, full disclosure, just let's be honest here. This is like North Park Theological Seminary. Come on, somebody. This could be such an intimidating environment. So I mean, yes, I studied Hebrew and Greek and Old and New Testament theology in Bible college like 1,000 years ago. But anyway, this is what I know. I'm a Black woman, a licensed therapist, a writer, and someone who knows a little something about full-time ministry and someone who is deeply loved by God. So I can walk comfortably in those lanes all day. So I'll keep telling myself that when I keep saying this is North Park Theological Seminary. So finding rest in God as our theme to me sounds peaceful. The sheer possibility would demonstrate such a sign of spiritual maturity, self-care proficiency, right? I think the reality, sadly, for finding rest in God can often feel merely aspirational, ironic even. People in places of ministry or theological learning who the world outside might see as working for God often are guilty of working excessive overtime without the required breaks, with nonstop assignments and working vacations. Sometimes we can spiritualize the lack of rest and healthy rhythms by bringing up the idea that what we do and how we show up in the world has to do with our calling, from God. And whatever one understands their calling to be or not to be, what it's not is a license to burn out, no matter how important or essential your work and places of learning. I understand this notion of where to insert resting in God when your context feels like the stakes are so high. The idea of stopping or caring for yourself almost feels selfish and irresponsible. I mean, literally, someone's marriage is at stake. Someone's dissertation is at stake. Someone's deadline is at stake. Someone's safety is at stake. Someone's grief is at stake, or someone's life is at stake. So before I share a week in my ministry work that illustrates this point, I want to share a conversation. It was March 10th, 2020. After 20 minutes into my long overdue meeting with my spiritual director, Debbie Blue, she was handing me her cell phone. Mid-session, she had phoned a place that provided 24-hour silent retreats. This had never happened before. She wasn't asking me to consider this. She was making it clear that it was non-negotiable. She had listened to my schedule for the past several months as the director of global personnel, and one that included managing the fallout from back-to-back demonstrations involving emergency evacuations in Ecuador and Chile. The lingering fatigue behind my eyes told the story of my relentless workload. So forgoing the normal politeness and spiritual direction courtesies, she was insisting that I stop, like full stop. And I promised her that I would absolutely follow through with that reservation. But the next day, the World Health Organization declared that the coronavirus was officially a pandemic. So I had to break that promise. And so for the next few months, I would be a member of our denomination's Global Emergency Response Team. We were called GERT. Sometimes we were called Gertrude because we were strong in our opinions. Creating and implementing guidelines and protocols for 100+ worldwide global personnel. I would be tracking global travel details, including quarantines from airport to airport, providing communications that relate CDC guidelines. So I also wondered if the rest that Debbie was suggesting from the verses that she often prayed over me was even possible. And like before, which was read, she would read over me. Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me, work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. Matthew 11, 28 through 30 from the Message. Which brings me to my ministry week that challenged every notion of finding rest in God. May 25th, 2020. As a team member, I continued working with the Global Emergency Response Team, caring for and tracking travel, potential evacuations. Our team meetings were frequent with time-sensitive emails, phone calls, and detailed accounts of the last flight information, State Department mandates, and quarantine processes. As a Black woman, I was still grieving the loss of Ahmaud Arbery, trying to remain hopeful that finally many people across political lines were seeing how tragic and egregious his loss of life was as he merely set out to go jogging. I was grieved that morning at a news story of a white woman in New York threatening a Black man who was bird watching and endangering his life with a weaponizing call to the police. And then the news story broke of George Floyd. Tuesday, May 26, 2020. Before my workday began, I wrote, I woke up yesterday morning to a video recording of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He was moaning and pleading, I can't breathe, please, I can't breathe. I stared at the image of George Floyd. I stared at the image of police officer's knee on his neck, a knee that remained there for over 8 minutes and 46 seconds. George Floyd was surrounded by three other officers who never once considered loosening the grip of his noose. One officer's gaze dared and on any onlooker to question his actions of Black Lives Matter defiance. Surveying the crowd with indignant eyes, he was poised to exercise his muscles of terror on anyone who dared to threaten his catch of the day photo op. I couldn't stomach to watch for more than 30 seconds. The officers were responding to the suspicion of a forgery taking place. An unarmed, we have you on the ground, surrounded and subdued forgery suspect. A man hoping to be seen as worthy of dignity, worthy of basic decency, worthy of being allowed to breathe. Instead, he was guilty of false hope. With his face forcefully scraping the asphalt, he was also found guilty of impersonating a human being, complete counterfeit of a man whose life mattered, the exception of being a child of God. Man was lynched by police yesterday. Minutes before this story, there was an incident of a woman calling the police in Central Park. She called 911 and fired off the phrase, I'm being threatened by an African-American man, like a loaded gun. Amy Cooper pointed her historically deadly Emmett Till engraved verbal weapon more than once, frantically stating again for effect the threat to both her and her dog. She demanded the same level of obedience from a man who should have every reason to be afraid. Amy Cooper said the words African-American as an indictment of a crime already committed. How dare you demand your humanity with me? The move insisted. As justice would have it, the video of her threatening rant was unleashed to a disapproving public. I cannot believe my mom right now is calling me on the phone, people. Just so you know, that is my mom. I cannot believe it. Oh, actually, I can't believe it. Sorry, Mom, I really do love you. I'm not even phased, people. You just don't even know. Mom, I'm actually on right now presenting, and I love you, and I will give you a call back and share the recording. I love you so much. That's my mom. The call came on anyway. That's okay. So the video of her threatening rant was unleashed to a disapproving public, a public not impressed with her ability to remember all the lines from her Birth of a Nation, Jim Crow era damsel in distress plays. After her theatrical phone call went viral, then came the written requisite if anyone was offended statement. She noted being humble twice as she issued an "I desperately wanted to keep my job and my non-racist reputation" apology. She asked for forgiveness for an intentional threat, the kind of 911 calling threat that could easily be categorized as an attempted murder. One man averted being lynched yesterday by the white supremacy while another was taken. Harvard graduate Christian Cooper, the Black man with the latest hashtag, birdwatching while Black, says he continued recording Ms. Cooper because he wasn't going to be intimidated and would not participate in his own dehumanization. Begging the question, how many people out there continue their silent, complicit participation in Black dehumanization? How many families? How many institutions? How many systems? How many churches? I don't know the answer to that question. I'm no longer holding my breath. My Black life was already out of breath when I woke up this morning, already enduring too many laps of the resilience and lament race, not having the privilege of dealing with and relaxing my way through episodic grief. I instead needed psychological ventilator to resuscitate my breathing from the 24-hour news levels of pain and anguish. Sure, I remain standing, knowing that Black lives matter to God, that in addition to creating life, God is the author and the finisher of life, the one who actually sings and delights over my life, who sits on the throne of righteousness and justice, who literally breathes life into all mankind. And yet my hope is out of breath. My patience is out of breath. My trust is out of breath. My peace is out of breath. My joy is out of breath. My tears are out of breath. My words are out of breath. My love is out of breath. My prayers are out of breath. My longing for justice is out of breath. A man was lynched by the police yesterday, out here in these pandemic streets. He couldn't breathe. So that's what I wrote. And then I began my workday. There is still a deadly pandemic raging, people. Families with children to be evacuated from their countries of service, travel guidelines to be communicated. According to news reports, there are also nonstop worldwide protests happening at this time. I can't personally confirm this as I made the decision not to watch any of the coverage. It was a choice that I made. I could either do my job or watch the coverage and lose my damn mind. I couldn't do both. I could not do both. In the book, Black Fatigue, How Racism Erodes the Mind, Body, and Spirit, Mary Frances Winters writes, Jamani D. Williams is a Black man. In a passionate and tear-filled extemporaneous comments at a press conference regarding the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd in the spring of 2020, he said this about the impact of racism and police brutality on the Black community. I am not okay. I am not okay today. And I want to give the Black community permission, and I want to give the Black community the permission to say, I'm not okay. I'm tired. I'm tired. I not watch the video of Ahmaud Arbery. It is too much. I not watch the video of George Floyd. It is too much. Black people have to go to work the next day and be all right. I am not okay. I am tired. I am tired of racism. Williams described Black fatigue. She goes on to say, I define Black fatigue as repeating variations of stress that result in extreme exhaustion and cause mental, physical, and spiritual maladies that are passed down from generation to generation. So Wednesday, May 27th, 2020. On the one hand, it was a necessary and essential continuation of our global personnel pandemic care. I continue to stay away from most sources of media covering the now massive global response to George Floyd's death. On the other hand, May 27th was also the 6th anniversary of my best friend's death from ovarian cancer. I thought it was especially meaningful and bittersweet that she always encouraged me to write. And on this day, my writings were first highlighted in a major Christian publication. Thursday, May 28th, it dawned on me that I had not cried about George Floyd's death, but I have been dealing with a headache all week long. Obviously, I was crying inside. Friday, May 29th, our team helped one of our global personnel successfully navigate an upcoming surgery after several delays and roadblocks due to COVID-19. And there were hospital restrictions, there were protocols, and all kinds of things that prohibited that. So we were very excited to be able to help him take care of that appointment. Saturday, May 30th. Because my cell phone number is available to all our global personnel, I received a phone call at 1 o'clock, midway through my Saturday morning writing group. It was odd, as I thought my calls yesterday finalized, the hospitalization for this person, but it wasn't about the hospitalization. Their youngest son had taken his life that morning in another country without travel possibilities for his family. Unable to simply care for that moment, word was posted on a public forum before all the relatives were notified. So now my day was filled with grief, irritation, and anger. And my 11-hour day ended with a check-in phone call on one of our recently evacuated global personnel families. It seems the location where they were relocated were mere blocks from fires burning due to the outside agitators disrupting the peaceful Black Lives Matter demonstration. We had an intense conversation about them wanting to remain in their neighborhood as a show of solidarity, and I needed to juxtapose that with my responsibility for their safety. They were not job team members to me. They were family with children. So let me breathe. That was my week. So raise your hand if you found areas where showing up for my job was optional or negotiable, right? And please don't get me wrong, while I appreciate your indulgence as I share my story and my experience, this is not unheard of for many of you. You too have navigated seemingly relentless work, school and ministry contexts while dealing with chronic, debilitating illnesses, severe mental health concerns in your family, eroding family relationships, caring for family members living with disabilities, financial crises, significant home repairs, and other straining environmental conditions. So this challenge of finding rest in God applies to everyone here in this room. And just before anyone gets the impression that I am a licensed therapist who has successfully navigated the waters of finding rest in God, as seen in consistently upholding beautiful boundaries, balance, and work-life rhythms, you would be sorely mistaken. I'm not even close on most days. If my self-care was a music genre, it would not be rhythm and balance. It would be rhythm and blues. My self-care would be singing the blues. And yet, some of my preaching and finding rest in God, proselytizing to others, has made a difference in my own life. So let me take you back through that week for some of the behind the scenes glimpse at some mindful attempts of finding rest in God. On that Monday, May 25th, with the death of George Floyd and worldwide Black Lives Matter protests as the backdrop, fostering a sense of mentally finding rest in God meant continuing my practice of not watching beautiful lives who were now hashtags being murdered on film. To do so would risk suffering, triggering, and PTSD, and would also counter all the whatsoevers in Philippians 4:8-9, all those whatsoevers. Brothers and sisters, whatsoever is true, whatsoever is noble, whatsoever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you've learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. I could firmly believe that Black Lives Matter, use my gifts and my voice to bring about justice, and also demonstrate that Black Lives Matter by monitoring what images I allow to be proximate to my eyes and to my soul. Tuesday, May 26th. In the past, I would have been guilty of behaving in this season in a manner that took on yoke and unnecessary burdens that God never intended, brandishing what Dr. Shanika Walker Barnes describes in her book as strong Black woman. Don't confuse that, not a strong Black woman, but strong Black woman, one word, in her book, Too Heavy a Yoke, Black Women and the Burden of Strength. How she categorized this term, strong Black woman, she describes it this way. She writes, the strong Black woman, one strong word, is the woman who constantly extends herself on behalf of others. In her intimate and family relationships, on her job, in her church, in her community, she's the go-to woman, the one upon whom others depend when they need assistance, counsel, or comfort. Driven by a deeply ingrained desire to be seen as helpful and caring, she's practically incapable of saying no to others' requests without experiencing feelings of guilt and worthlessness. And her willingness to help repeatedly reinforces others' tendencies to ask her for help. Her very nature becomes defined by multitasking and overcommitment. A modern-day atlas, she bears the weight of her multiple worlds upon her shoulders. And unfortunately, she's incapable of saying help as she is of saying no, since from childhood, she's been taught that a good woman, especially a good Black woman, is independent, a giver, and not a receiver of help, including emotional, financial, or instrumental support. Moreover, as a woman of usually Christian faith, if she does need help, it should come from only one source, God. Thus, fearful of being seen as unfaithful, the strong Black woman invests considerable effort in maintaining the appearance of strength and suppresses all behaviors, emotions, and thoughts that may contradict or threaten that image. Even as the physical and psychological toll of her excessive caregiving mount up, she maintains a facade of having it all together and being in control. I knew what my breaking point would have been. I didn't need to be Superwoman, but I did need to have alternate healthy rhythms and means of relinquishing my burdens to God. Resting in God for me means writing as a way of listening to God, listening to my joy, listening to my lament. So even though I was not able to avert my gaze from ministry responsibilities to the 24-hour cycle of demonstrations and world response, I could find a means to process, a place to restore my soul. Whatever or whenever there's a sense that you recognize, whatever or wherever there's a sense that you recognize the goodness, power, grace, beauty, sovereignty, and magnificence of God is where you'll also find your rest, by the water, on a hike, through music, with silence, with meditation. Where God shows up for you is also where God's rest for you shows up. I'll say that again. Where God shows up for you is also where God's rest for you shows up. So on that Wednesday, May 27th, it was bittersweet. I was over the moon excited with my piece being published, and I decided in that moment to celebrate my friend's legacy of friendship and encouragement, rather than making the loss and grieving and mourning central. Finding rest in God looked like allowing joy to have a place alongside the pain and hardship. I could honor my friend's role as a catalyst for this moment and forever attach her to the goodness, of this moment. Finding rest in that moment meant reading the 27th Psalm because it was May 27th, and my rhythm is to read Psalms every day, and the 27th Psalm had a wonderful place of reminding me of God's sovereignty and love and power and strength in that moment. So I let it wash over me in that season of unknowns and destabilizing fear. The Thursday, May 28th, with a week-long headache, finding rest in God looked like finding myself some Advil and water, finding some quietness, being mindful that my body has limits. And even though tears had yet to be shed for George Floyd, there were obviously signs that I was experiencing deep grief. I needed to be held in prayer and in wise counsel and in a loving community. And for me, that meant spending time with my spiritual director. It meant finding a therapist. And because I'm a Black woman working in predominantly white spaces, during this Black Lives Matter, now worldwide phenomena, and although at work, I have incredibly thoughtful teammates and global personnel who pray for me and encourage me regularly, I needed a place to go outside of work and ministry, to be cared for and understood at a different level, with similar friends and similar contexts. I needed the wisdom in Black friends working in the same kind of spaces to process the grief of the Black Lives Matter movement in the moment and at that moment. And I would encourage all of you listening to find your tribe of pastors, seminary students, parents, global personnel who understand your story and your context intimately. God's rest and restoration can be found in soul-nourishing friendships. Sheila Wise Rowe, in her book, Young, Gifted, and Black, says, the challenge is how to engage in all the things that we love and feel compelled to do while caring for ourselves in a way that acknowledges that although our body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, we're also human. And I'm coming towards the end of all this. On Friday, May 29th, even with the fullness of my ministry work comes an appreciation that I had the privilege to work with some pretty incredible people in the office and around the world. My gifts were suited for this kind of work, and it felt good to see our team accomplish through tough challenges. During a pandemic, our global personnel made extraordinary decisions and displayed caring and sacrificial leadership. When Frederick Buechner says, the place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet, that rings both true and satisfying. God's rest is found in the ease and joy of operating in God's strength and witnessing the purpose and meaning associated with our calling. So on that very tough Saturday, I was reminded of also Frederick Buechner, who says, here is the world. Beautiful and terrible things will happen. Don't be afraid. Walking alongside others, tragically losing a loved one, especially a child, is a challenge no one wants to face. It's the most crushing place to find yourself. And yet, that even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death in Psalm 23, shares where our place of rest can be. It shows up in God's presence as we share tears with each other, hold grief with each other, hold precious memory and bittersweet stories. God rest shows up in the sacred, unexpected laughter that can also happen. Our circumstances may not change, but we're comforted in how God shows up with such holy tenderness, with the beautiful reminder that we really can trust him with all our cares, despite the seemingly insurmountable circumstances filled with overwhelming challenges and needs. We can rest assured that God is God enough for us. God is God enough for our ministry, our educational, or our mission context. So let me ask you, are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me, get away with me, and recover your life. I'll show you how to take a rest, a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. Matthew 11, 28 through 30. Thanks.
Amen. Thank you so much. Wow, that was beautiful. And I see the beautiful dance between what Hillary said and what you're sharing. This is powerful, powerful presentations. Thank you so much. Turning it over to Professor Dotson right now. The floor is open. Keep the chat going. Any questions that you may have, and she will direct you. Thank you, Michelle.
Yes, thank you so much, Deborah and Hillary. That was amazing. As Professor Elizabeth has shared, the chat is open if you have any questions. I am going to kick us off with a question while folk are formulating their thoughts and typing into the chat. So Hillary, I really appreciated the questions that you gave us to consider. And so my question is going to be a play on that. I know that I've experienced walking alongside people who are so caught in that rhythm, one of the rhythms that you described, Deborah, where people are just going and going and going, that they don't even know what rest feels like. And so I want to ask, how do the two of you experience rest in your bodies? How do you know when you have entered into that rest, especially in those seasons when it's just going and going and going?
So I go first, Hillary. Typically, I found a place to slow down, usually in front of some water, a body of water, and the tears start to flow at first because I get things out, you know. And soon after that, either my context of friends or something that I'm engaging taps into my natural joy that I have of laughter and just and relaxing, you know, even laughing about the crazy things that are happening around me. Our GERT team, we were like so tight knit, you know, because we were just in this thing that was so immediate, but we laughed all the time at things that came up, at our fatigue, you know. So I think I know when there's been some sort of a stopping place to let the tears come out. That's the first measure of that. I need to release that. And then, yeah, and then I'm impressed again, ultimately, with God's tenderness, because it feels very impossible, the things that we go through. It feels like you can't possibly meet this and care for this need, Jesus. You just can't, you know. And then with tenderness and with a sense of something that really feels like this transition from the chaos of it all. And some parts of that may not even stop. I mean, those things still go on. But with me, what's happening is this is ability to see the goodness happening, the impact of what God's doing happening. And I feel that. And I feel that in my release of tears and of my laughter and my joy. Again, that's been sort of stagnant.
So good.
Yeah, I like that too. I think there's a freedom to experience a deeper level of joy and then also peace. And you asked how you feel it in your body. And since that's what we do as psychologists, I feel it as kind of an easiness to breathe. And then also a quieting of the mind, an ability to really be present with what I'm doing. And whether that's praying or talking or doing a task, I can be present with it. I'm not 100 places at once. I'm kind of more focused and peaceful, and I don't have that anxiety about like the performance anxiety. There's just a kind of a piece and if this doesn't work, it's okay. God's got it, you know.
That's good. Thank you so much for those answers. There is a question that has come in from Nancy Poland to you, Deborah, and she writes, how would you counsel caregivers, for example, someone taking care of a spouse with a chronic disease like Alzheimer's, who are typically overwhelmed and believe they can find no time for rest?
Yes, I have friends in similar categories like this, and first, I just want to affirm and acknowledge that that's 24/7 care and love and extension of yourself. So, you know, and because of that, there are not a lot of people who know what your experience is like. So just getting together, having some sort of Zoom call or connection with others who are going through similar experiences, because that context is very specific. And there are folks who care for you and want good things for you, but knowing the nitty-gritty of what you're going through, I think it's helped, number one, in community. So finding that that friend or that context where others are finding having similar experiences. But the other two is that sense of knowing that if you were to step off the grid a little bit, or having that time to care for yourself, or allowing someone and using that, whether it's finances or whatever it is still sacrificial to allow you to be able to get that rest in a way, you know, from the 24/7 aspect of this, and trust that God will also take care of your spouse while you're doing that, you know, and understanding that that will allow you to return even that much more healthier for yourself. You know, and those are all easier said than done when finding that place to get off and to do that. But I think one of the starts for me that I mentioned in the piece was that sometimes our cares and our context are so specific that we need someone else who knows exactly what we're going through, exactly the routine, who may have insights as well from a posture of knowing. But the whole sense of that, the community care, but also releasing yourself to be able to care for yourself without guilt and without the sense of God's love for your spouse is just, it's beyond yours, you know, and so that kind of renewed understanding that God will take care of your spouse as you're giving yourself the freedom to care for yourself a little bit with some time away and some time of rhythm to come back poised stronger, if that helps.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Hillary, did you have any thoughts on that you'd like to share?
I think I love what your response is. And I think when we're in those settings, so my mom actually died from complications related to Alzheimer's. And so I know about this personally, as well as from a counseling perspective. And I think that you get in a space where your options seem so limited. And so asking somebody to come and help you to see the options who's not in it every day can be really helpful, and kind of just getting that advice to open up the options to see, oh, I don't have to do it all. There are resources out there, but you're so overwhelmed in the moment that it's impossible to find those resources for yourself. You need someone to come alongside you.
That's awesome. Thank you. Here's another question that is coming from Catherine Werner. How would you recommend communicating the value of needing rest and taking rest time to those around you, particularly those who may know you as someone who is always on the go and have high expectations of you to be constantly working? That's a good one. Hillary, would you like to start us off on that one?
Sure, I'll start us off. It is difficult, I think, as a woman particularly to communicate this because the system puts different expectations on women. But I think it's powerful to just say it. Just say, hey, I need a break. I'm at my max. Because that shows, particularly, people know that you are trustworthy. People know that you are hardworking. People know that you can meet impossibly high expectations. And so saying I need a break actually lets other people say it too. That's the simple response.
But what I loved about Hillary's presentation is that she talked about the context for having rest actually happen. So from a systems point of view, like if you're in your work context and you're in your environment kind of has that as an expectation that you're going to rest, you're going to stop, and there's rhythms there. From up high, I love the systemic response that you had, Hillary, to this for the work environment. But to your question, Catherine, and hello, Catherine, your amazing self. Yeah, I think the more you start to sort of own the fact that your rest, is non-negotiable. And sometimes, in my case, as I read in the piece, I was my own worst enemy. I still can do that, to all of a sudden not do the resting thing or modeling not doing the resting thing. So I think once you sort of recognize that, hey, this is a necessity, my rest is a part of the work, and the success of the work, that that becomes a part of your voice. And I think finding your voice to say it to yourself, kind of check yourself on your own stuff that you do this unhealthy. And then once you've done that, and hopefully do that soon, that, to those around you, kind of saying, if you believe in my proficiency and my skills and my insight, let me share with you the benefit of what rest looks like, so I'm going to model that for you, so yes. Oh, it's a long one there. So that's my response. I'm sorry, that's my 7 going, oh, look, the chat's going. So I'll finish that thought. So that's my thought on that. But I was kind of seeing the chat here. That was a long.
I also think just from like a practical boss level, people who are well rested are actually more efficient workers. And so the productivity research shows that productivity does go up. And so you can make a case that rest is actually the best thing for the bottom line too.
And no one's going to ask the question about how much sleep we all get and those kind of things, because that may or may not be someone's business or not. But Hillary speaks truth. She does.
So good. So this next question is from Max Lee. And I'm sorry, did I say Max? Yes, okay. So first he points out just his appreciation for being able to share, Deborah, the way you shared your experience of kind of walking through that week with George Floyd's murder, and speaks about the similarities between those who are pastoring immigrant churches who are not able to maybe take rest, but find the practice of shalom, of being able to find rest in the midst of the storm. But the question that he asks is, so professional care or other mental health resources might be needed in addition to spiritual practices. What signs and symptoms are there for the pastors or leaders that God might be leading us to seek rest beyond our go-to rhythms of ministry and life?
And I would just say too, if in that question is this idea that I think by virtue of what you're doing every day, as a therapist, of course, I'm always going to think therapists are the end all. So I think that's a natural rhythm to have for anyone, just the once a month check-in at minimum, just kind of, because what you're carrying a lot, and you can't always see from the outside the impact of that. But I would definitely say one of the things that would kind of lead to signs and symptoms that you're kind of beyond your natural rhythms are to the extent at which those normal rhythms, you're finding that there's a disruption, that somehow your normal sort of joy, your normal sort of rhythms where you're doing things in a mostly, for the most part, efficient kind of way, that there's a disruption of that. There's something where you're sensing, this real challenge, or others are commenting on this challenge, or so there's something that's very distinct about having a negative impact on your relationships, on your work, on your health. If those things are kind of heightened or sort of exaggerated in a way where it's just not your typical, I'm a little bit stressed, or I have this minor thing here. And others maybe comment to you as well. You're having a community. And I think, and that's everything too, just kind of back to the idea of having a therapist and having someone who's doing check-ins. If those are going well and consistent, those will be places where folks may be able to pick up for you. Hey, something's a little off here or whatever. So having some outside people to kind of help you to be aware of that, because I would imagine in the intensity of working with immigrants and other communities where there's lots of trauma, that the vicarious trauma and the holding of that is going to be impactful as a given, So I think, right, I think if you have those rhythms of check-ins with other professionals and other folks who know what kind of rhythm and ministry you have, that will probably be some of the indicators. I think those kind of disruptions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are kind of some telltale symptoms too of compassion fatigue or burnout. And some of those are going to be like difficulty concentrating, difficulty sleeping, nightmares, so increased anxiety, increased startle response, particularly when you're working with trauma and hearing people's trauma. And so you hear the garbage man drop the dumpster and you jump. That might be a telltale sign that you're carrying around some trauma, somebody else's trauma. You can also, if you're increased irritability and agitation, you find yourself getting angry faster. Those are times that you might want to say, okay, I might be reaching kind of burnout, compassion fatigue stage. And we actually have a training that we developed on this, an online training. I can share it in the chat if somebody wants anything. It's pretty thorough. It takes a couple hours actually to go through. But you can skip around if you're interested. I'll send that to you as well.
That's awesome. Thank you. So this is a question from Dean Hanna, and it comes back to something that you had started to share, Deborah, but what practical suggestions would you offer those with influence over systems for how restoration can be built into work culture, for example?
Yes. Well, I think, first of all, I'll say that I have the privilege of having, in my immediate context, Grace Shim is my supervisor now, and Al Tuzan was before this. And so they had an understanding of what systemically is helpful to sort of foster this place of rhythms of rest. But I'll give you even a practical thing of what our work week looks like. One of the things that we did was, having an open space for long weekends. Let's say that on the one hand, some things are just non-negotiable. You have things that happen where there's just a rhythm where you cannot get beyond these seasons where it's going to be a heavy season. What you can do with your calendar is to put in place the opportunity for a long weekend. So we did something like making Fridays a no meeting Friday, so that someone could have a long weekend if they'd had a period of time where they couldn't get off the grid. Then there's an opening for a longer weekend. So actually putting in rhythms in the calendar for off time, or even something as we have. And I'll talk again from my lane. We often, in my role, have to give the global perspective of how global personnel may be engaging with all things in our office, how to care well for them because their needs are specific. And so there's things that I might bring to the greater domination for a global perspective. I may have a staff member who, in this case, have a team member who's African-American, and she's working mostly in white context. So caring for her would look like allowing her to go to events where there's caring for her soul in this space. So even making allowances both from a managerial or supervisory context for rules about the rhythms that can foster care. But then also the other thing is having check-ins. When our group is served globally, when there have been major events that have happened, having a chance to debrief how folks are doing, checking in at one-on-ones and group processing. So some of those rhythms where we're just mindful of how folks are engaging around their rhythms, how they're engaging around their cultural needs, how they're engaging around what may be globally influenced versus domestic. So sort of keeping that lens in mind for sort of fostering opportunities for rest, if that helps.
Hillary, did you want to share anything related to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I agree with all of those things. I think if you look at some of the redemptive business literature too, that can give you some good ideas of how not to kind of play into the oppressive system of capitalism. Can I say that? And to be able to be focused on kind of more of a redemptive state. So some of those policies can be helpful if you're looking for just policies. And then you can also, just think about, I think it's great to review your policies and see if there's anything that is really prohibiting people from resting. And so you might see things like, if there are quotas on productivity, is there enough flexibility in that if somebody has a bad week, that they can make that up in some other way? So what are your backup plans that are kind of built into your systems as well? And then I'm very big on just not seeing your employees as producers, they're people. And so that doesn't mean they can't produce well. It just means that that's not the whole of who they are. And so being able to treat them as human beings with real needs and creating spaces of safety and belonging are always important.
Thank you.
Yeah, Hillary, I love that, your idea around the idea of, yes, you can talk about capitalism, and I think in our world of ministry, we often have this phrase around stewardship, what that looks like. In our mission world, that's thrown around a lot about what good stewardship is, and I would also like to counter, and it is good stewardship to also care well. And sometimes caring well does involve money, and that should be guilt-free, because if the outcome is healthy, whole people, then those are resources well spent, as opposed to this idea of this negative connotation of, yes, being, legitimately mindful in places where there is, limits and limitations, and where we invest and where we put our dollars in terms of our care for our people is super important. I think the ECC does a really good job with sabbaticals and pastoral response and care, which is really wonderful for folks to take advantage of that. But yeah, that's super important to have a healthy idea of how we deal with money and finances and resources and and those terms like stewardship.
So this next question comes from Eric Landon, and Hillary, he highlights your comment that if we aren't experiencing the yoke of ministry as gentle, lowly, and compassionate, then it probably isn't Jesus's yoke. So his question is, what are those other yokes that we pastors, ministry leaders, and others in caring professions tend to put on instead? And how can we personally become more aware of what yokes we're wearing?
I think probably the pastors and ministry leaders in attendance could answer this. Everybody carries their own yoke. And so the ones that I see the most frequent in ministry are kind of the savior yoke. I am the savior, not Jesus is the savior. Or I must be the one to meet the need. And so a lot of times it's just the self-directed, I'm the only person that can get the pride and self-righteousness become a yoke. Works-based salvation becomes a yoke. That's the one Jesus is explicitly talking about, right? That that anything that you feel like if you don't do this in the right way, and that God's going to be that's going to take away your salvation, is probably a yoke. And God does call us to do things. I'm not saying that he doesn't, but and then I would say anything that you end up at the end of the day being worried, if this is taken away from me, then I will collapse. I will be done. I will be finished. I will have no purpose. I will have no meaning. I will have no joy. If there's anything that you can think of that fits that bill, And then that's probably become a yoke for you as well.
Yeah. And hi, Pastor Eric. I was going to say that, okay, I cannot get away from having the puns. So it sounds like what you're asking is, how do you handle things in such a way where the yolk doesn't leave egg on your face? Is that where, if the egg on your face is the issue? I think when you have that, it's because one of the areas is the idea of fear. A lot of things are fear-based. A lot of things are, if I don't do this, how God will see me. If I don't do this and I'm not in charge of this, somehow God's impression, the world's impression, my faith is somehow reduced because I've inherited, whether through faulty discipleship or false, sort of past teachings, this connection between how I see God as disapproving or how I see my achievements as God loving me more. And so if I get so bound in this fear of getting it wrong or not showing up or being critiqued, then yeah, the results are burnout. It's like this catch-22. On the one hand, you're trying to do all these things to show God how impressed God should be with you. And then the other hand, you bring yourself out because it is way too much and it wasn't asked for you to take in the first place. But a lot of that sometimes is based on this very fear of God and fear of God's disapproval and judging your own service.
Excellent. So I think we have time for one, maybe even two more questions, depending on how it goes. But so this question comes from Chrissy Palmerly, and I hope that she's okay that I said her name. But just thinking, she'd love to hear your thoughts on, especially as we're thinking about rest, but what does the practice of Sabbath keeping, how have you all experienced that? And what are your thoughts on that? Deborah, would you like to start us? Or Hillary who's unmuted first? I don't know.
Sure, sure I can. So ask the question again, please.
Just to hear your thoughts on the practice of keeping Sabbath and how you've experienced that, and just again what your general musings are on that.
Yes, I think my Sabbath practice before has been highly aspirational. I believed in the idea of it. I watched good people live it out. So I've always felt good about it, about the concept. But in recent years, really sort of learning to take advantage of that and really specific actual time, money, resources spent towards that. So I know that it's something that when it has been in place, because I go through seasons where my Sabbath rest, like many things in life, is it can be seasonal, and probably the last few years, it's been on my mind more to be more adherent about those rhythms. But it is a challenge, and I tend to, I tend to kind of think take shortcuts where I think that, like for instance, my writing is a place where it gives me a lot of joy. It does a lot of work, but it isn't the same as going out, look at the ocean and stopping and having, a different kind of a moment and rhythm that I really do enjoy. So I think what I'm trying to get better at is just putting it on the calendar, because it's been aspirational for a while, and so I think when I put it on the calendar, when I'm mindful about just spaces where there's not the phone call or there's not the disruption or whatever, it works. But honestly, it's a challenge because there is so much and the work is full, that's why we're laughing, because no one wanted to go first. unless Hillary is totally knocking us out of the park and just going to say, Deb, let me save your little Sabbath, your non-Sabbath soul.
Yeah, no, I mean, my answer might be a little bit of a cop-out. That's why I didn't want to go first, because I think for me, Sabbath rest, and the way that I've been experiencing it is really knowing that Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath and that he has fulfilled the Sabbath, and clinging, and so making Sabbath rest not just a day that I take off, although that's great, but a consistent practice and reminder that Jesus is my Lord and that he brings me rest. And so just like, in between each client, I do a check-in with God. How are we doing? Right? And, come into this space, come into this place. This is sacred, holy ground. And that is kind of bringing Sabbath rest throughout the day for me, every day.
Well, I just want to thank you both for just such thoughtful presentations and thoughtful responses. There were a couple questions that I wasn't able to get to, but I want to be mindful of time. So I'm going to go ahead and just close us in prayer, and then I'll turn it over to Dean Hanna to close us out. So please pray with me. Thank you, Lord. God, I thank you for that word. That final word, that you are Lord of the Sabbath. I thank you that you are a God who calls us to rest. You invite us to rest. You beckon us to rest. And in you, we find the ability and the place to rest. And so, Lord, with all of the things that have been shared this afternoon, I do ask that even though we may not hold on to every kernel of wisdom, Holy Spirit, those things that are for us, for each person who is on this call, that one thing, maybe two things that you desired them to hear and receive today, I ask that nothing would remove it, that you would allow it to be seed on fertile ground, that it would produce fruit, and that you would call it to our minds when we walk away from this call as another invitation from you to grow deeper into this practice of resting. So please be with us as we go into the rest of our day. Help us to be mindful of you and to bring glory to your name in all that we do. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.
I just want to add my gratitude to our phenomenal speakers for their generosity of the expertise and wisdom that they have offered us today, to our phenomenal ministry field faculty members for planning and facilitating this event, and to all of you who have joined, and especially those who have asked questions that have enriched our engagement. And that last question was actually a perfect advertisement and transition for our final announcement, which is just inviting you to save the date of April 12th, which will be the third and final session for this series. It will be sponsored by our Bible field faculty, and the theme and title is Sabbath Without Sabbatical, Pastoral Rest in the Midst of Ministry. So keep your eyes peeled for the registration link for that event. Once our poster is ready, we'll be sending it out to all the ministry priority leaders, the executive ministers, and publicizing it in a variety of ways. So we hope you'll join us for that final event. And once this session is, once the recording is up, I'll send an email to all of you who have registered so that you can rewatch or share the recording with others who are not able to be here. So thanks to you all. Thanks again also to Luke Palmerly for all his work behind the scenes in making this possible. So blessings to you all, and see you April 12th.